see a lot of people coming in. Let's give everyone 1 minute and then we'll get started. Good morning and welcome to our final preparation for BERDO compliance webinar. My name is Sharon Dupuy, Sales Manager for New England at NRG Business, and I will be your moderator today. We are in the final stretch before the May 15th filing deadline, and this session is focused on what building owners can do right now to manage cost, reduce risk, and approach their first emissions compliance filing with confidence. Today's conversation is to help you understand where you have flexibility and where action matters most at this moment. Next slide. Here is a quick look at what we will cover today. First, we will talk about what matters most before the May 15 filing so you can focus on the highest impact items. Next, we will review what can still be changed before the deadline, including where last-minute decisions can influence cost. Then we will walk through compliance options and what next steps can look like based on your building or portfolio. We will leave time at the end for questions that were submitted in advance. Next slide. Before we get started, I want to introduce today's speakers. John Holtz is Senior Director of Market Development and Regulatory Affairs. John works closely with the City of Boston and helps interpret how BERDO requirements apply in practice. Hans Rotman is a Senior Manager in Technical Sales. Hans works directly with customers on compliance pathways and will walk through options and considerations later in this session. Together, we will cover policy context, compliance mechanics, and what this means for Boston building owners making decisions right now. This slide covers our required safe harbor language. The key point is that today's session is for informational purposes and does not replace guidance from your legal or compliance advisors. A few quick logistics before we move on. The chat is turned off for this session. Questions were submitted ahead of today's webinar, and we will address those toward the end of the presentation. Technology sometimes does its own thing, and it can be out of our control. If you experience any technical issues or are unable to stay for the full webinar, a recording will be available. I'll turn it over to John to walk you through why this moment matters in your compliance journey. John?
Thank you, Sharon, and good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us this morning. So, have you ever booked an event like way out in the future, put it on your calendar, and thought to yourself, I'll worry about that when it gets here, when it gets closer, and then suddenly it creeps up on you? Well, that date is here, BERDO Day, May 15th. In all seriousness, the first emissions reduction compliance filing for large buildings is May 15th in a little less than a month. And this first compliance filing, of course, applies to non-residential buildings of 35,000 square feet or larger, or residential buildings with 35 or more units. Now, it's not too late. Buildings can still take action to mitigate their 2025 emissions and also address future emission reporting compliance requirements. So the focus now is on preparedness. Next slide, please. So certain things have not changed. You've been reporting emissions, energy usage, water since at least 2022. That hasn't changed. There's the third-party verification requirement for your data that's being submitted to the BERDO staff. And of course, the annual emissions, you have to reduce those annual emissions below the emission standards that apply to your building size and building type. So none of that has changed. There's still the ordinance. The reporting and emission standards continue, and the performance thresholds, those standards will increase over time. Next slide. So what's changed since last year? Well, obviously, this is going to be the first emissions reductions compliance filing. And so now you're going from, just plain reporting and planning to actual accountability. And with that comes enforcement. So the BERDO staff will have to enforce, and there are penalties that for late filings as well as not meeting the emissions standards. So waiting to that deadline really limits your options and can potentially increase your costs. Next slide. This slide here shows you the timelines, beginning with the beginning of the BERDO ordinance back in the summer of 2022, those initial reporting years, and now, of course, the first the emissions compliance filing this year, and then for the large buildings, and of course, the next milestone will be for the smaller buildings beginning in January 2030. And those standards then will continue to increase going out over time. And those standards will increase over time. As you heard from Sharon in my introduction, I'm in regulatory affairs, and the last letter of the acronym BERDO stands for ordinance. An ordinance, of course, is a law, and the city is obligated to enforce its laws. And being in regulatory affairs, my subject matter expertise is compliance and enforcement by government agencies. And so just so you're aware, there is an enforcement process that would go into effect come May 15th. And it starts with, if you're either late with your filing or you haven't addressed any emissions that exceed the standards for 2025, well, you could be subject to a notice of apparent violation from the city's environment department. And then the environment department will investigate, communicate with you, and work with you. And what you don't want to have happen then is have that escalate to the BERDO review board. It's the board that issues the notice of violation with the potential penalties. And as you may or may not be aware, those penalties are $300 for failing to file or file late, and then $1,000 per day for large buildings that haven't addressed their emissions standards, with a maximum annual penalty of $365,000 for a year of noncompliance. But that's not meant to scare you. That's just meant for your awareness, because there's still time to avoid any costs. Next slide, please. And those ways to avoid, of course, are addressing any emission standards that exceed or any emissions for your building that exceed the BERDO standards. Now, there are several pathways to do that. One is, of course, upgrades and appliances, electrification, improved building installation and controls, smart thermostats. Well, that's great, but as far as the current filing goes, kind of running out of time there to deliver and install devices. At the other end of the spectrum, you could pay an alternative compliance payment, which is pretty expensive, as you can see here from the slide. But in the middle, you've got two choices that you can do and join right now. One, of course, is the Boston Community Choice Electricity Program, which is the municipal aggregation program of the city, which includes power as well as RECs. Or you can look at NRG's renewable grid connection product, which utilizes an approved PPA, an approved power purchase agreement for solar power, approved by the city of Boston. And so here's my colleague Hans Rotman to tell you more about how you can take action now to cost effectively meet the BERDO emission standards for 2025 and beyond. Hans, turning it over to you.
Thanks, John. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you all today. Let me start with building on what John has discussed here in regards to the path of using renewable energy to address any excess electricity emissions. Remember, the renewable energy alternative is only available to address the electricity aspect of any excess emissions that you have. So you see here 4 specific alternatives within this path. The Green 100 plan, this is part of the Boston Community Choice Program that John referred to. One key aspect of this program to remember is this entails to committing to the city's community choice program for both energy and the rec. You would have to switch from any retail supplier you have now or from traditional city supply. So there's a specific commitment to buy energy through this program as well. Mass Class 1 recs are also an alternative. This is actually a fairly straightforward alternative, but you can see the pricing there depending on the amount of excess emissions you have to address. The recs are trading around $40 each. This is honestly a modest savings versus the alternative compliance payment. Now I'm going to skip down to the bottom option, local renewable generation. The challenge with local renewable generation is it needs to be in the city of Boston. And as you are probably aware, there is limited supply of wind, solar inside the city. So very limited, especially at this late moment. So the other path here on this sheet here is, of course, a power purchase agreement. Now, I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with PPAs, as we call them, but they are generally complex, very long-term agreements requiring significant credit. It may be a 100-page contract, a lot of complexity, which for most building owners is not practical. But for companies like NRG, large energy companies participating both in the generation and retail supply aspect of this business, this is something that we do regularly often. Still complex, but it's part of our business. What we have done, and this is something that John and I specifically have worked on with the city of Boston, we have worked with the ability to give building owners access to one of our PPAs. So it is a PPA that works within the guidelines of the regulation, but the customer doesn't need to go through that long, complex endeavor to do a PPA on their own. Let's go to the next slide. So the result is what John referred to is our renewable Grid Connect product. And ultimately, and as you can see here, and I'll dive into this, we have a PPA that has been approved by the city of Boston. Customers get access to that PPA through Renewable Grid Connect. And you can see here on the left side, the bullets describing this product. NRG has a PPA with a project, and we signed the PPA before the project started operating. Again, we've been working on this whole product since 2024, maybe 2023. So we've been working on this for quite a while. The project was not in operation when the first transaction we did with the building owner was executed. So we executed a deal with a building owner before the project started operating. We manage all the risks and costs of the PPA, contract and financial settlement. That is honestly the piece that for most building owners, not all, that is beyond what you want to get into. The energy from the PPA is delivered to the grid. It's not sold to someone else, so there's no double counting that we're trying to sell the energy to one party and then to a customer and then give a Boston building owner access to it. The customer receives title to the RECs, which we will retire on the customer's behalf and give you documentation thereof that's in the contract. And ultimately, the customer receives certain marketing rights. That really means you will get the name of the project, and you can say, I bought this product tied to XYZ project. You can see the letter on the right, and this is ultimately documentation from the city of Boston. And it may be a little tough to read, but bottom line is, if you do a transaction with us and you provide us the building owner name and the BERDO ID, we submit that to the city of Boston, who will then send us an updated version of this, which will reflect, you can see in the middle here, it says building owner. We whited the building owner out for confidentiality purposes. It would have your building owner's name on this document, specifically referring to the fact you can see in the first paragraph This is to notify you to approve the PPA between Waco Solar, that is actually the name of the project, and NRG, and it has certain information there of where the PPA is located, etc. So this is a very strong document from the city of Boston approving the PPA that can tie to your building. You can go to the next slide. Here are some details on the actual retail contract. This is not the full contract on the left side, just a few key pieces detailing the multi-year nature of it, the retirement of the RECs. You can see the Exhibit A ties to the specific building and its address, and then the Schedule 1 identifies the specific project, the specific renewable project. Ultimately, it's a flexible product that we have built for customers. It is separate from retail supply. So whether you are a retail customer of ours or someone else's, you can execute this contract with us. There is a total volume of RECs transacted, but we have contracts that vary year to year. And since we have an approved PPA, we can add additional transactions to the contract, or if you need more RECs later in your term, we can amend your contract appropriately. We can also allocate the RECs over multiple buildings. It doesn't just have to be one building on the contract. Next slide, please. You're probably already aware, but the city has a lot of resources available in regards to BERDO. They have a very useful website, which includes a specific analytical tool that will show your emissions compared to your limits. You see a snapshot from that on this slide, which would show any potential alternative compliance payment. You'll also see there are some buildings that have no excess emissions for 2025 and to 29, but the rules, as John said, get stricter as time goes on. So if you have no need for the first 5 years, you may see it here, but you may have a need in 2030. The rules keep changing as the thresholds change, as the city ultimately wants to achieve its goals by 2050. We will put together a specific analysis using the City of Boston data compared to our product, so you can see how many RECs you need to acquire through the RGC product and what the specific savings are. We are generally seeing savings over 30% compared to the alternative compliance payment and mass class 1 RECs. So depending on your need, the savings can be quite material. I'd also want to point out, we do have customers that might have a solution in place starting in 2028. Maybe they did a PPA, but they have a need for 25, 26, 27, for example, or they have a partial solution in place. Our solution can also be used to fill gaps. So we're willing to talk to you about a solution that fills part of your need, but not all of your need. We are very flexible in that regard. Next slide, please. So key takeaways, as John said, BERDO Day is coming. So there is enforcement will begin this year. The deadline is May 15th to address your 2025 emissions. Obviously, that's not very far away. And NRG has a product that we can give that gives you access to an approved PPA and may significantly reduce your cost. We would love to talk to you about it in more detail. And thank you very much for the opportunity to present to you today. With that, I'll pass it back to Sharon, who can take any questions.
Thanks, Hans. Now we will move into questions. We are going to start with the questions submitted ahead of time, as many of them reflect themes we are hearing broadly from building owners right now. If we cannot get to every question today, please know that our team will include them in our recap email. I also encourage you to connect with your NRG account executive or energy broker if you want to understand more about what we discuss. The first question is for you, John.
Okay.
The customer says they have already filed under BERDO. What should they be focused on now?
Okay, well, thanks, Sharon. You know that the first Emissions reduction filing is a very important milestone, obviously, but it's not the end of the journey. So while 2025 emissions data cannot be changed, you can't do anything to change the past, building owners still have full control over how they prepare for 2026 and future compliance years. So the focus now should be on planning ahead to reduce future risk, avoid last-minute decisions, and create more predictable costs as the emission standards for BERDO tighten over time.
Thank you. And I have another one for you. BERDO enforcement has felt kind of quiet so far. A customer wants to know if they should be concerned about penalties.
Well, yes, obviously, and I mentioned that in my part of the presentation. That's because this is the first filing deadline with penalties. Penalties are clearly defined in the ordinance, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, and they're tied to emissions performance. Waiting, of course, limits your flexibility and options. And planning early allows building owners to manage that risk on their own timeline rather than, reacting later under pressure of perhaps a notice of a parent violation. But of course, the city's not going to hammer you immediately. They will work with you to help you mitigate and satisfy your parent violation. And of course, one of those could be our Renewable Grid Connect product.
Thank you. And another one for you.
Okay.
Does federal sustainability policy uncertainty change BERDO requirements for buildings?
No, not at all. BERDO, of course, is a local ordinance, not a state or federal, and it remains a required compliance obligation for covered buildings in Boston. Federal policy changes do not eliminate these local reporting or emission standards, and the city is very committed to seeing this program succeed. So filing will continue, and performance thresholds will continue to tighten over time.
Thank you. Hans, one for you. How does NRG help simplify BERDO compliance?
Thanks, Sharon. As we mentioned in the webinar, we have an approved PPA. It's been approved by the city and through Renewable Grid Connect, which is a pretty straightforward product. We give customers direct access to that approved PPA that can address any excess electricity emissions in a very straightforward way. I think that's the pretty straightforward answer for that question, Sharon. Thanks.
Thank you. And that concludes our questions. If you have not finalized your compliance approach, now is the time to act. The remaining window before May 15 is where planning can still make a meaningful difference. Connect with your energy account executive or energy broker to understand how Renewable Grid Connect fits your building or portfolio. Thank you again for joining us today, and we appreciate your time.